We're now on the last line of Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. Yesterday we spent a lot of time here on the sugya on Lamed Amud Aleph on the bottom of the page in a machlokas between Ben Zoma. In a machlokas between Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda. As far as the requirement of tefillah during the entire course of the year, when a Kohen starts his avoda and he goes into the Azara, ala boker, Ben Zoma derives this requirement from the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim with a kal v'chomer. The Kohen Gadol, when he went from one avoda to the other, and from one set of begadim to the other, he required tefillah, even though when he went from one location to the other, it was all Bakodesh, it was in the Azara, and it was Bifnim in the Heichal, while vice versa. And in both places, both locations, there would be a Chiv Kares if a Tommy would enter in there. So we have the Kedusha of Migdash. And yet, between one avodah and the other, one that took place outside the Heichal in the Azar and the other inside the Heichal, he was required to take a tefillah. This, despite the fact that he's tar, we have no reason to suspect that he's tameh. How much more so in the case of a Kohen during the course of the year, when he goes from a makom chol into a makom kodesh, he goes from the Arabayis into the Azara. He goes from a place where the Tmeim would not incur a chiyuv kares into a place where a tamei, if he went in, would be chayiv kares. How much more so does he have to acquire tefillah? And Rabbi Yehuda rejected it. And Rabbi Yehuda says that the entire enterprise of tefillah for a kohen who's tar, when he enters into the Azara, is the Rabbanan. It's the Takanas Chachamim, and his language is Kadeshi Yizkar Tuma Yeshana Shebiyadu. Maybe it'll jolt his memory. And now the Gemara wants to know, what's the mashma'ut? What's the meaning or the significance to this machlokas? Is it a theoretical machlokas? Ben Doma says that the requirement of tefillah the whole year round is doraisa, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's only Rabbanan, or is there a nafkimi? And now we turn to Daf Lamed Amud Beis. In Kodshim, especially with regard to the Avodas HaKohanim, we often distinguish between Lichatchila and B'di'evet. And if things are ideal, the Avodah has to be done just so, but it's not critical. And if the Avodah wasn't done just so, then B'di'evet, the Avodah is valid, and the Bala Karba will not have to replace the Karba. And the Gemara wants to know, what would happen in a case where the Kohen did the Avodah, B'di'evet, he did not do the Tefillah about which we are debating between Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda? Sometimes a requirement is absolutely critical, which means that if that requirement has not been fulfilled, then the Karban is completely invalidated. It has to be replaced. And that's called chilul avodaso, desecrating the avodah. So Gemara says that's going to be the subject of the machlokas here between Rabbi Yehuda ben Zoma. Yachule avoda kamifliki. The ben Zoma mechel avoda. Ul Rabbi Yehuda lo mechel avoda. What happens with the Evid post facto if the Kohen did the avoda and lo and behold he didn't have a tefillah, but he's tar? And Ben Zoma is going to go as far as to say, according to this Gemara, that chilel es avodasa. What should I say? It's like a Kohen who goes in mechusar begadim. He's not wearing all his begadim. You remember we discussed that he's mechal his avodah, he's chayiv karei, he chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. And according to Ben Zoma, if we derive tefillah the whole year round of a regular Kohen coming in the morning to do, let's say, the Avodas HaTamid from Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, then we're talking about a critical requirement of Tvila, the absence of which will be machal the avoda b'di'evet. And that avoda is an avoda psula. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda, lo mechel avoda. He doesn't accept this kal v'chomer. The Chachamim made a takana so that the Kohen would think about the possibility, maybe he'll jolt his memory, that maybe he contracted tumah. But we don't know that he contracted tumah. He has a cheskes tara. Therefore, if he has a cheskes tara, says Rabbi Yehuda, and he went in and he did the avoda without tefillah, okay, he's violating the takanas chachamim, but it's not going to undermine his avoda. Now, Rabbosai, keep in mind that we have a principle in Kal Vachomer called dayo, which means that what you derive from the melamed could never exceed beyond the melamed. The best you can get is to equate the melamed, the nilmad from the melamed, but the nilmad could not go beyond and surpass the melamed. So now, if you're telling me that according to Ben Zoma, the absence of tefillah, the avoda is mechuleles, and that's derived from the Kohen Gadol, you must be assuming that in the case of the Kohen Gadol, if he didn't have the tefillah, then his avoda would be mechuleles. Because if you're not going to accept that, if you're going to say that even in the case of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim, the avoda requires tefillah as a lechatchila requirement, but only as a lechatchila requirement, and b'di'evet, if he did the avoda without tefillah, it's avodaso eina mechuleles. Then how can you derive a conclusion, as the Gemara presents now, that according to Ben Zoma, in the absence of tefillah of a Kohen the whole year round, the avodas mechuleles, which is a derivative from Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim, says the Gemara, Ula Ben Zoma mi mechil. Can you honestly believe and maintain the position that according to Ben Zoma, in the absence of tefillah, the avoda is mechuleles? For Asanya, we have a brisa with regard to the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim. Kohen Gadol shelo toval v'lo kidesh, if he omitted his tefillah and his kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, is bein beged lebeged ubein avoda leavoda avodaso kshera. So imagine, lo tava. Again, we could talk about lo kiddush later on, but lo tava. And he's now going from one avoda to another avoda, changing his begadim from big day lovin to big day sava, vice versa. And in between, he needs a tefillah, and he ignored to implement the tefillah. Says the brisa, avodaso kshera, despite the omission of tefillah, the avoda is kshera b'di'evet. Now, the next part of the brisa is going to address a different case, but let's take a pause here. If we only had the Reisha, which is part of the brisa that we just read, and it says Avodasa Kshera, we clearly understand that the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim, who omitted his tefillah, does not effectuate a chil avoda, because it says Avodasa Kshera. And that undermines and torpedoes the entire Kal Vachomer of Ben Zoma. Because again, the Nilmad could not supersede beyond the Melamed. You can't tell me that the tefillah of a Kohen Hedjot during the entire course of the year, which is a derivative of the Kohen Gadol, will be Machalas Avoda, when the Brisa says explicitly that even on Yom Kippur there's no Chil Avoda if he omits the tefillah. Okay, now let's take a look at the Sefer of this price. Echad Kohen Gadol, the Echad Kohen Hedjot, Shelo kidesh yadav v'raglav shachris the avad avoda avodaso psula. So the Resha that we just learned addresses the case of the absence, the omission of tvila. The sefer that we're learning now addresses the case of the absence of kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. And kiddush yadayim v'raglayim is an absolute critical requirement before the avoda. In the case of tvila, all right, he started an avoda, he shifts from one avoda to the other, and he omitted tvila. That's not so great, but tvila is not critical. He's tar. But Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim is a din of a machshir. It sets up a gavra of a kohen ha'oved, and it's absolutely critical. That's why the Sefer the Brisa addressing a case where the kohen omitted Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim is coming in contrast to the Reisha, and the Brisa wants to point out that even though we said that b'diavad in Tvila, the omission of Tvila does not undermine the kashrus of the carbon is and the avodah is kshera. But in the case of Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, it's critical. And therefore, in Lo Kiddush Yadav Raglav Shachris, before he started his avodah, then Avad Avodah Avodah Psula. In any event, getting back to the ratio, which is the part of this price that's most relevant to us, in the case where he omitted Tvila, from one of in between one avodah and the other, it says here in the Bryce that avodah kshera. So Ben Zoma, who's going to derive the tefillah shachris for every day of the year and every kohen from tefillah on Yom Kippurim with a kavachomer, when Yom Kippurim itself avodah kshera. So don't tell me that the nafkamina between Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda is whether achule avodah. No. Even Ben Zoma agrees that the absence of Tvila does not in any way impinge or undermine the avodah. So how can you possibly tell me that if the Kohen during the entire balance of the year omitted the tefillah before he started his avodah, then the avodah is mechulelas according to Ben Zoma? That can't be, because Ben Zoma in this brisa maintains that even on Yom Kippurim, which is the whole source for this tefillah, that's the malamed. If he omitted tefillah, his avodah is kshera. I'll just read to you the pirush here. He writes, Hare Ben Zoma lomed es chiyuv tvila shachas mikavachom mitvila Yom Kippurim ben avodos. He, meaning the tefillah of the Erev of Yom Kippur between avodos, Eino Ma'keves is gam tefillah shachris Eino Ma'keves is avodah. So now the Gemara has to come up with a substitute, a different interpretation of the nafkamina between Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda in this machlokas. Ella lemekim be essay kamifligi. So for this, we have to mention the pasuk in Vayikra Tes Zayin, in the parsha of Achrei Motz, with regard to the avodah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim. It says Ksones Bad Kodesh Yilbash, and then it says Verachatz B'Saro, Verachatz B'Mayim Es B'Saro Uleveisha. So the Torah says Verachatz B'Mayim, and that's a requirement of Tvila. LeBen Zoma Koi B'Esen. Ben Zoma reads this pasuk kipshuta, which means that if he does the avodah without tvila, then he violates what's called an iser aseh. That's called a mekim b'eseh. The Torah commands him v'rachatz b'mayim es psaro, implying that he's not allowed to do the avodah unless he was rochetz mayim es psaro. He went into the mikveh. And that's called an Isser Aseh. We all know what an Isser Aseh is, as the Torah formulates an Isser in a language of an essay, like Tishbos, which generates an Isser of Malacha. The Torah says it as an essay, so that generates an Isser Abba Mechlal essay. And here too, in regard to the Avodah, the Torah says, V'rachatz b'saro b'mayim es b'saro. Would mean not that Tvila is a critical part of the Avodah and an absolute requirement, but it does mean that the Kohen Gadol is enjoined with a mitzvah of Virachatz B'saro, and if he omits Tvila, he has violated the Isser essay of doing the Avodah without Tvila. Rabbi Yehuda, Okai the essay. Meaning, Ben Zoma derives the Tvila of the whole year round from the Kohen Gadol's Tvila on Yom Kippurim. And with regard to the Avodah on Yom Kippurim, the Torah commands him Virachatz B'saro and requires Tvila if he does the Avodah on Yom Kippurim without Tvila, he omits the Tvila. Then he violates this essay, which commands him Virachatz B'mayim. And Ben Zoma is going to take it a step further, and by virtue of analysis of equation, he's going to say that if a Kohen does not go into the mikvah when he starts his day in the Mikdash, he violates the essay of V'rachatz B'saro B'mayim. Again, this despite the fact that the pasuk V'rachatz B'saro B'mayim is addressing Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim. But Tzach HaKol, as we said before, he's going from Kodesh to Kodesh, from Onish Kares to Onish Kares. And yet, the Torah says, V'rachatz B'saro B'mayim. If he does the Avodah without Virachatz B'saro B'mayim, and he wasn't Tovel B'mikvah, then the Avodah certainly is Kshera, but you should know he violated an Isser essay of Virachatz B'saro B'mayim. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, he never accepted the Kal V'chomer, which we explained yesterday, why he rejected the logic of the Kal V'chomer. And therefore, we're not going to say that he violated an essay. A Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim is enjoined to go to the mikveh, to be Mitayr himself. But that's only the Kohen Gadol. And therefore the Kohen Gadol will be guilty of an Isser essay if he does the Avodah without Tvila. But that has no implication as far as a Kohen Hedjot the whole year round. He doesn't violate an essay. So it's very interesting to me. The initial answer to the Gemara, which the Gemara rejects, is a practical nafkamina. The second substitute or replacement explanation of the nafkamina seems to be purely theoretical, because you don't give malchus to someone who violates an essay. So you want to know whether he violated an essay or not. So Klape Shmaya Galia, up in the heavens, you'll go up to the heavens and you'll find out. It seems to be totally theoretical without any practical nafkamina. Now, I've mentioned in the past a sefer called the Siach Yitzchak. If I'm not mistaken, he was a Talmud of the Gaon. In any event, he wants to derive a very important conclusion from this sugya. We have a principle of ein mazhirin min adin, that for a violation to apply in a particular case, in a scenario, that violation has to be explicit in the Torah. The fact that you can derive it from a different context with a Kal V'chomer is not enough. There's got to be an azhara mifureshes, explicit, and not a derived Kal V'chomer. Says the Siach Yitzchak, Zed dafka be'isur lav, but not as far as an essay is concerned. Because the Gemara says that if a Kohen Hedgel the whole year round does the Avod in the morning and he goes into the Azar and he didn't do his tefillah, he didn't pay due to go to the mikvah, that according to Ben Zoma, he violates an Isur essay. Where is that Isur essay in the Torah? The only Isur essay about not going into the mikvah is Yom Kippurim, with regard to the Kohen Gadol who went in between one Avod and the other, and he failed to do tefillah in the mikvah. Now you're deriving a Kohen Hedjot through a Kal V'chomer, but we have a principle of Ein Mazhirim Min Adin. Says the Siach Yitzchak, Ein Mazhirim Min Adin only applies to a lav, but not to an essay. So now the Gemara says, Umi Islay Rabbi Yehuda Haisvara. And you really maintain that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if a person goes into the Azara, he requires Tvila, albeit Midrabanan, by virtue of the Takanas Chachamim. Vasanya, don't we have a brisa that in terms of the what's called the Seder Kaparas HaMitzorah, which takes place on the 8th day, in other words, on the 7th day, after he was cured from the tzaras, he goes to the mikveh. And then on the 8th day, he has an entire process of tara. And the brisa says, Mitzorah Tovel v'omed b'shar Nikanor. Shar Nikanor, if you remember, is the entranceway into the Azorah, but it's not inside the Azorah. It has a din of chol. And he's not allowed to enter into the Azorah because he's mechusar kapara. You know, his tara process is not complete until on the 8th day he brings his karbanos. So he can't enter into the Azorah, but rather he can go close to the Azorah, to the entrance of the Azorah, which is called Shar Nikanor. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Tzarech Tvila. Rabbi Yehuda holds that on the 8th day of the Mitzorah, he doesn't need a Tvila. Shekvar Taval Mi Ba'erev. After all, it's on the 7th day of the Mitzorah's purification, he went into the mikvah. That's an absolute requirement. But to say that on the 8th day, before he brings his kapara, he has to go through another tefillah, that's totally redundant. That's a repetition of what he already did last night. So therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, Ein Chashash Tuma, since he went to the mikveh the night before the 7th day. But in any event, we see clearly from Rabbi Yehuda that once a person is tahar, he doesn't have to be matire himself with another tefillah. That's totally unnecessary and redundant. And that's against our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says that the tar needs tefillah before he enters into the Azara, even though he's tar. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda here is claiming, in the case of the Mitzorah, that once you're tar, you don't have to go to the mikveh a second time around. Now let's go back to the brisa, because Rabbi Yehuda gives his explanation. He says, Shekvar Taval Mi Ba'erev. Let's underline the word Mi Ba'erev. How long of a period of time has elapsed between the first tefillah and now what the Chachamim want to impose a second tefillah? Let's call it 12 hours. Because Mi Ba'erev, the previous evening, is when he went into the mikvah. So what are you going to tell me, that he became tamei in the 12 hours between the evening and the morning? There's no reason to suspect that that would have happened. So that's the Gemara answers, Hahu Kidiktani Taima. The din of Rabbi Yehuda that he alleviates the requirement of tefillah on the 8th day of the Mitzorah Rabbi Yehuda tells you explicitly the timer, the reason why he doesn't need a tefillah shekvar taval mi ba'eret. I don't understand what the Hava means. That's what the Gemara is going to ask now, but at least we have the Maskana. The Maskana of the Gemara is that kvar toval mi ba'eret, that if a person went into the mikveh just last night, we're not going to require that in the morning he goes to the mikveh again. Shekvar toval mi ba'eret. Ein anu tzrichim boy hazara torim litfol ela b'shvil sheyizkru im yesh aleim ezu tumi yishanav ha'mitzora kevin shetoval esmol hare nitar kvar mikol tumas ha'yishanos. So if you're talking about a Kohen Hedgel the whole year round, and he in the morning he comes into the Azor to do the avoda, and the Rabbanu want to jolt his memory, maybe he had some contact with Tumah, and it makes sense that Rabbi Yehuda, by virtue of this Takanas Chacham, requires Tvila. But in a case of a Mitzorah where he was Tovel the very night before, then Rabbi Yehuda is going to say he doesn't require Tvila in the morning. So Gemara says, "Who the Karile my the Karile?" What was the Makshan thinking when he asked this question? When Rabbi Yehuda explicitly says, "Sharei kvar toval mi ba'eret." So the Gemara answers, "Mishum de kaboy lemimra achriti ale." What the Makshan was doing here is he was asking one question in order to lead to another question. The first question was just a lead-on question. And the purpose of that question was to read the Brisa meticulously, in which the Brisa says, Mi ba'eret, harei kvar toval mi ba'eret. But really, in truth, he wants to ask his kasha from another Brisa. Lishka Samitzoroim, why is this Lishka designated exclusively for the lepers, for the Mitzoroim? Lefisha Sham HaMitzoroim Tovu. So it means, again, this is the Tanakama, we'll see Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, that we require a special Lishka, a chamber, that's outside the Azara and is dedicated for the Mitzoraim to go through Tefillah. And then after the Tefillah, they enter into the Shara Nikanor for the Matan Bahonos, for the purification. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Lo Mitzoraim Bilvad Omru Ela Kol Adam. Rabbi Yehuda points out that anyone who wants to go into the Azar requires tefillah. But it's clear that Rabbi Yehuda would say in the case of Mitzorah that he has to be tovel before he hones in and comes to the Shara Nikanor, even though the night before he was tovel. Lo kasha. Hadu tavil, hadu lo tavil. There's no contradiction here in the two statements of Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda said he doesn't need tefillah on Yom HaShvi, that was a case where he was tovel on Yom Shvi. He doesn't need a second tefillah. But now you medayik from the second brisa that Rabbi Yehuda says that he requires a tefillah, and not only the mitzvah but kol adam. That's a case to lo tavil. He wasn't tovel on Yom HaShvi. So the Gemara asks, "Ilo tavil is harev shemesh boy." The din is that harev shemesh operates to complete the tara, but only after the tefillah b'mikvah. And now you're telling me that we're talking about a case where he's lo tama, that on Yom HaShvi the mitzorah was not tovel. So now he needs a hariv shemesh, because the hariv shemesh of yesterday of Yom Shvi is no longer valid because there was no tefillah, and the hariv shemesh could only be valid after tefillah. So the Gemara is basically saying that if he doesn't require Harav Shemesh the second time around, meaning on Yom Shmini, it must be talking about a case where on Yom Shvi he was Tovel and then he had Harav Shemesh at the end of Yom Shvi. And now the question is, why does the Brisa say that he needs a second tefillah on Yom HaShmini? So this is where we're going to stop for today because the sugya keeps going on and on. And Belinetta tomorrow, as an introduction to the next part of the Gemara, we're up to Ella Idi V'Idi. We'll have a quick review of the contradiction between the two statements of Rabbi Yehuda and the attempt of the Gemara to try to reconcile. Okay, then. So let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a wonderful day. And Belinetta will see each other tomorrow.